All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a terrific lunch and time to form new connections. So this is our first panel discussion out of 3 on meeting future energy demands in Southeast Asia sustainably and securely. I am exceptionally honored to be in the company of my panelists and have the great pleasure of introducing them very briefly. Otherwise, we'll take an hour for sure just to go through all of their contributions and accomplishments. I am delighted to have with me Admiral Jim Ellis, who is the Annenberg Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And he oversees the Strategic Global Policy and Strategy Initiative and the George Shultz Energy Policy Working Group. He has had a distinguished career in government. His final assignment in the US Armed Forces was a 4-star admiral and commander of the US Strategic Command. And in this capacity, he oversaw the US Strategic and Space Forces. He, prior to this illustrious military career, was also a fighter pilot, a Top Gun pilot. And in addition to his military accomplishment, he is an engineer with his expertise in nuclear energy. And actually, just as of last week, has been elected to chair the US National Academy of Engineering.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Congratulations. Okay.
And I'm also extremely pleased to introduce Cheng-Hung Liu, first and foremost, a Stanford alumni.
Twice over.
Yes. And he began his academic studies in biology, later morphing into management as a Sloan Fellow at the Graduate School of Business. Like Admiral Ellis, Cheng-Hung, a Singaporean, is also a former 2-star Rear Admiral who served as the Chief of Navy of Singapore between 2017 and 2020. And today, he is the Chief Executive Officer of Infocomm Media Development Authority and also the Commissioner of the Personal Data Protection Commission. We think of him as the Chief Technology Officer of Singapore. So I couldn't have a better panel to discuss this topic of meeting energy demand sustainably and securely. So I thought I would begin by just framing the discussion a little bit on 2 of the primary driving forces to deliver a sustainable energy transition. And those are economics and security. Now, in terms of opportunities, as was commented by Geeta earlier, the region will undergo tremendous growth in the developing parts of ASEAN, 7 to 10 times growth in the use of energy. There are also parts which are seeing tremendous growth due to artificial intelligence. Malaysia is one example. And also the emergence of carbon markets, for example, in Singapore. So these are tremendous opportunities. I think we could not live in a better time in terms of growing demands. At the same time, there are also challenges. And it was already alluded to earlier, again by Geeta, on the affordability of energy. In Indonesia, for example, the average price for coal electricity is 4 cents per kilowatt hour. That's incredibly difficult to beat. At the same time, due to the heterogeneity in Southeast Asia, there's also inequity in availability of affordable, clean, and secure energy in the region. So in the panel today, we're going to explore some of these topics to talk about the economics, to talk about the security, and talk about the innovation. So to start, I would like to invite Cheng-Hung to comment a bit and give us an overview on the energy transition in terms of the supply side and the demand side in Southeast Asia, especially highlighting the heterogeneity in the region. Chuen.
Well, first and foremost, always a great pleasure to be back on the farm. I just want to thank Will and I guess the school for this wonderful summit that places, I think, in my mind, very important emphasis on Southeast Asia that in the past may have been a little bit less so. Heterogeneity, when you talk about Southeast Asia, I think it's a truism to say there isn't actually a thing quite called Southeast Asia. It's very unique as far as the heterogeneity is concerned. And a lot of that drives then the discussions around sustainability. Pak Gita actually mentioned a few of those, but maybe if I were to just focus on one element, which is, they always say geography is destiny. And if you really look at geography of Southeast Asia, it tells you a lot. First, there is the continental part of Southeast Asia, which is your CMLV countries. And the reason they're called Indochina, because if you look at history, it was the clash of the civilizations between Indonesia and China. And if you look at the colonial background associated with that, heavy French influence. And then there's the maritime Southeast Asia. And because of maritime Southeast Asia, a lot of it driven by the maritime trade, a certain different texture as far as colonialism is concerned. And then sort of between the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the British, the influences have come about as a result. If you look at, a country like Indonesia, for Americans, I kind of checked the facts recently. It's 3 times the size of Texas. So you can imagine that sheer heft as far as the economics as well as sustainability. And then, of course, on the other extreme, you've got Singapore, which is actually smaller than Manhattan as far as population is concerned. So I think within here is that huge diversity, because it also means that when it comes to renewable potential, for example, the renewable potential across the different parts of Southeast Asia are drastically different. And for example, Singapore, you would call it a renewable starved country. And then when it comes to alternatives, the gifts to Southeast Asia, hydro and associated with continental parts in Laos, for example, is a huge plus. And being in sort of the maritime parts, the geography of being a volcanic island chain, and then therefore geothermal is a very, very big part of that as well. So I just want to leave this with just a few pegs to sort of think about it from that geography elements and how that really underpins and is actually quite a fundamental structural driver as far as the sustainability conversation is concerned. I will end off by echoing what Will yourself said, is that if you look at the sheer population within Southeast Asia, it's, I think, currently standing about 680 million, give or take. That is twice that of the US. It is 1.5 times that of Europe. Its growth has been about 5% over the past couple of years. Today, I think about 2/3 are below age 35. Over the next, if I believe, up to 2035, 60 million people are going to go into the job market. 60 million is the equivalent whole of Italy. So I think that whole hunger and that drive for economic growth, here is where demographics is destiny. I think that hunger and drive for economic growth is a certain unifying element as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. We cannot ignore that fact, and there will be a huge driver. Economics drives everything, and there will be a huge driver as far as the energy use, as well as the energy mix, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned.
Thank you, Chuen. Admiral Ellis, you've been teaching me about the importance of security, and something that is etched in my head now is energy security is national security. Help us understand this in the Southeast Asian context.
Well, it's a great question, Will. And first, thanks for the invitation to be a part of this. As Will mentioned, I'm privileged to lead the Schultz Energy Policy Working Group, formed over a decade ago under the leadership of George Shultz and generously supported and both monetarily and by his presence by Tom Stevenson. So we've been interested, passionate, and focused on energy and energy security. But to go back to Will's introductory remarks, George Shultz would often remind us that in an analogy that I think has bearing on all of our backgrounds, energy is a 3-legged stool, okay? It's got an economic dimension, it's got an environmental dimension, and it's got a security dimension to it. And we would focus on each of those legs independently and then try and weave them together in a comprehensive way to address the challenges that are out there. George Shultz, again, had a way of bringing us home to the essential focus, and he'd say if you succumb to political interest at any given time and get parochial, those who neglect one leg of the stool for too long are apt to be mugged by reality. And so I think in a real sense, that's what is happening to us today. We've got now, unusually and perhaps unexpectedly, a very charged geopolitical landscape, arguably the most difficult we've faced in generations by any measure. And now we're assessing how we can make the appropriate energy choices, not just for America, but for the West, for our partners around the globe, for the countries of Southeast Asia, as the Admiral has generously indicated. And we've got to convene energy and national security experts alongside industry practitioners to think afresh about how our energy resources, technologies, and commercial markets can come together in ways to create platforms that allow us to deepen and reinforce these critical alliances around the globe. That's the essential element of energy security that I like to talk about. I'd like to quote, military folks like to delve into old quotes, and I've got one by an old Russian by the name of Vladimir. No, not Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Lenin, who once said, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And I'm not talking about our recent months. I'm talking a bit more broadly, and I think I might reframe that as Richard Haas once did, that there are decades where centuries happen. And I think we could argue that we're living in the midst of one of those decades. I mean, we've focused on some of the events of recent months, and appropriately so. They have their own set of challenges, and as Condi said earlier today, some opportunities as well. But the decade-long trend that we've seen with the rise of China, the reemergence unexpectedly of energy in a European conflict scenario that none among us would have thought of 5 years ago, and yet here it is. And then we confront that reality, navigating the world of great power competition and outright conflict. How do you deal with the economics and technology intersecting in ways that we haven't considered it before? And then they've got security concerns that come with that in new and ambitious ways. Shared principles, shared relationships have become so important as we craft this alternative for the future. In other words, an energy supply, affordable, secure, and environmentally responsible, is now central to concepts of national security. And you stole my throwaway line and my get off the stage line, because the point I would want to make is, unless there's any misunderstanding in the room, energy security is national security. And it's not a bolt-on addition. It's not an after-the-fact consideration. It's not something that we consider when all other things have been addressed on the table. It provides the fundamental underpinning, because in order to defend yourself militarily, you've got to be prosperous economically. In order to rise the standard of living in your nation, to create a vibrant and burgeoning and innovative middle class, you've got to increase your energy consumption. It's almost linear, according to all the studies. And so the security of energy and the energy security itself is the underpinning of that prosperity that we're all aspiring to going forward, hopefully in a peaceful era. But on the other hand, there's also other security dimensions that we have to think about. How do we combine these trends? How do we bring these shared values and opportunities to the table while using energy as a central pillar of our diplomatic and strategic goals? That's the challenge. Huge opportunities, as has already been mentioned, in the Indo-Pacific and in Southeast Asia specifically. There's some challenges. We've already talked about them. We heard the president talk about them, and Geeta as well. Heavy dependence on fossil fuels we've got to address. Infrastructure and grid limitations, which are real, largely because of geography. Archipelagos have a much more challenging way in creating infrastructure and sustainable grids over a widely diverse geographic background. Policy and regulatory hurdles, they confront us all. And so how we think about that, and then rising energy demand for all the reasons I spoke of earlier. But what are the opportunities? We talked about renewable energy potential. It's real and unarguable. Hydropower, biomass, geothermal, as was already mentioned in Indonesia and other contexts regionally. The energy transition and decarbonization. The bloom may be off that a little bit in Washington, but it's not off it in the rest of the world, nor should it be. And there's an opportunity there for prosperity that comes with that. Economic diversification follows in trail with job creation and the green energy industry. And then decentralization and off-grid solutions, I think, are the critical element that is going to best serve the interest in Southeast Asia. So I'd also be remiss if there's perhaps the only nuclear engineer in the panel here, if I didn't mention that the perspective on nuclear has changed dramatically here recently as well. The current and future role of commercial nuclear power in our energy mix was a long-time focus of the late secretary as well. And he described it as power generating technology with almost no pollution, practically limitless fuel supplies, reliable operations, scalable, and statistically far safer than existing alternatives. Nuclear power alone will not solve our energy problems, but we do not think that they can be solved without it. A lot has changed in the decade since the secretary uttered those statements for the good, and we now have opportunities that perhaps we can talk about in the question and answer period that might be available and might also represent a viable opportunity for our partners around the world. And then finally, as you hinted, Will, there's an energy dimension to military operations as well, as the Admiral knows well. I was fortunate enough to command a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. I refueled that ship every 20 years. Not bad. However, I was alongside a replenishment ship every third day in order to take jet fuel on board my carrier to fuel the airplanes that were launched from its flight decks. So my point is not to highlight on the Navy, but all of our armed forces and all of our security apparatuses are hugely reliant on energy security. And we've gotten spoiled, quite frankly, in some of our efforts in the Middle East and the like, where we have reliable energy supply, secure basing infrastructure. Should there be a crisis or a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to be much more challenging from an energy domain for those of us that might be a part of that conversation. We need to understand that. So in conclusion, I say that we've got an incredible opportunity, all of us, to lead the world. When I hear America first, when I hear anti-trade, when I hear too much about tariffs and about nationalism, it concerns me. It really does. But I'm actually okay with American exceptionalism. I think every country ought to think of themselves as exceptional. What I have trouble with is American triumphalism. We won, you lost. We've got more soft power at this time than any time in our history. We need to embrace that resilience and confidence. We need to lead, and we need to form mutually beneficial partnerships around the world. The next century of American energy and global energy will not be like the last. In the words of Abraham Lincoln, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. And I always like to end with a naval quote, and there's one that's attributed to Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "We must sail, sometimes with the wind, sometimes against it, but sail we must, and not drift and not lie at anchor. This is our opportunity. This is our moment. Let's sail." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ellis. So I'm an engineer and I'm an energy guy. So I'd like to break down and understand the key levers we have in thinking about the energy transition, especially in the Southeast Asia context. Secretary Rice mentioned energy mix on a number of occasions. I think that's a huge lever. That's the supply side. The transmission side is a huge opportunity, but also a challenge given the heterogeneity and the large area of Southeast Asia. And then finally, the demand side, with the rise of artificial intelligence, the energy demand, huge opportunity. So perhaps in that order, I like to pick the brains of our two admirals here in thinking about what are the trade-offs as we contemplate energy mix, transmission, and looking at rising energy demand in AI. maybe I can ask Admiral Liu to start by commenting on the energy mix side. What are the trade-offs that you see?
That's actually a fantastic question. It is such a large question, and I'm glad that sort of Will, you kind of broke it down. They always say that in energy, it's security first, and then affordability second, and then sustainability is always a distant third in sort of this order. And because in security, there is, in my mind, the small s. The small s of security is, do I have the power needed to drive my economic growth? And then there's the big S, which is security from a geopolitical lens, which we can kind of put aside for now, because there are influences as far as global powers are concerned, everything from BRI all the way to 123 agreements. So that's sort of that part of the house. But these are all very critical when it comes to energy mix. I briefly alluded to the fact that economic growth, if you're going to go at 5% a year for Southeast Asia for the next 20 years, effectively you're going to double. It's the rule of 70 or 72. You're going to double in the next 15 years. And generally, there is a direct correlation that the energy requirement will also double. So today, I think Southeast Asia is running at about 1.3 terawatts. Going forward, it will be 2.6, even with efficiency. So this is going to easily be doubling over the next 15 years. But the unfortunate reality is that about 80% of that is still fossil fuels. And actually, as far as electricity generation is concerned, of course, it varies a lot. Coal is still a massive component as far as electricity generation is concerned. And it just boils down to the simple mathematics of cost as well as IRR. When it comes to coal, just because, for example, Indonesia, because of the rise as far as consumption is concerned, it has slowly turned from being a net exporter to be a net importer of oil, net exporter to net importer gradually, I think by the end of the decade for natural gas as well. But I think it remains the third largest exporter as far as coal is concerned. And then therefore the ability for you to generate electricity through these make eminent economic sense. The IRR as far as such power plants are concerned actually make complete sense, as opposed to a lot of renewable projects. So you're actually fighting the energy mix on two separate counts, both from the actual cost of the materials itself, as well as the actual economic lifespan and the return on capital as far as the investment is concerned. So I think these two things are going to be impediments as far as how we can shift that energy mix. How do you shift that energy mix? Obviously, technology has a huge part to play as far as bending that economics curve. But on this side of the house, there are probably two very important things to consider. First, of course, is to right price the externalities. So right pricing the externalities as far as carbon taxes are concerned. And of course, removal of subsidies as far as fuels are concerned, because it leads fundamentally to economic distortion and overconsumption as far as that part is concerned. But then as far as I think you had briefly discussed, then on the demand side of the house, I think technology has a huge role that it can play. And it's not just about AI in and of itself. This could be actually very mature digital technologies which we use on a day-to-day basis. These could be your basic IoT connectivity and just basic algorithms. I think there was an estimate that just applying some of these on a day-to-day basis to grids, to energy efficiency, to controlling buildings will lead to a 5 to 10% immediate reduction as far as energy efficiency is concerned. So I'll just take a pause there, sort of to set some of that sort of broad overall context. And then subsequently later on, it would be interesting if you wanted to do a deeper dive into sort of AI and the actual technology itself.
Thank you, Chuen. Jim, building up on that very interesting discussion on the energy mix, one aspect is how much or how do we value sustainability? How do we value security? Give us a sense of how we should be thinking about ultimately tying everything back to economics. And Chuen commented on the externality, the carbon price, and so forth. Yeah. Walk us through some of your thinking on this.
Well, no, I think you're exactly right. And I think Admiral indicated that of those three stools, there's going to be an inevitable focus on the affordability piece, because it's who bears these costs is very, very important. I mean, we can, if we're not careful, we can tend to wave our hands and we can talk about nations. The United States pays this, Indonesia pays that. The fact of the matter is these costs are borne by somebody, by a human being, by a person, by an individual, by a family, by a factory operator or owner, or a small businessman or something like that. And I don't think we spend as much time exploring where those costs go. And so we can talk about subsidies, for example, which are one way of, promoting or preserving critical infrastructure or capabilities that are local, for example, that might otherwise not be cost competitive. But those who pays those costs, if they come out of the tax base, do they devolve to the average taxpayer, the average family, a business owner, and the like? And so I think we need a finer grained understanding of the cost distribution, and at the end of the day, who actually pays those costs. It's kind of like the questions we're asking about tariffs these days, who actually pays those? Well, it might be interesting to look at the subsidies as well and to understand that sometimes there's a legitimate need to do that. For security, small s, reasons, you make that choice to preserve that as a national opportunity, to take advantage of or encourage things that are uniquely positioned and contribute to your security, like we've been talking about with Indonesia and geothermal, and certainly with the solar radiance and the like. They've got huge opportunities there. But so I think costs are a big part of the economics piece. The other thing that we haven't talked about, Will, that I think is important is the tempo of what we're talking about, the time frame, the timeline, if you will. I think we've articulated the energy transition as almost, you should excuse the metaphor, turning a light switch. And we're now going to go to all renewable, and we're not going to do any of this with carbon fuels anymore, or carbon-based economy. We all know that's not possible, not physically possible. As of late, I'm not going to be able to take a train from Palo Alto to Paris, for example. I'm going to have to fly. There's going to be some transportation that's inevitably going to require fossil fuels. And I joke about it, but the reality is there. If we think about this more as it's titled, an energy transition that blends in when it's acceptable. Now, we all know that stasis is a part of the human condition, and none of us wants to take risks. And if we don't encourage, or we don't pursue, and we don't set goals and incentives, we might just be content to stay where we are. But over the longer term, if cost is coming down, as we now see it is in the renewable space, dramatically in many areas, if the costs of subsidies are deemed to be onerous and unaffordable, I think there's going to be economic drivers that might allow that to assume more prominence in this conversation. Now, it can seem a bit strange to have a military guy, ex-military guy, talking about costs, but there are costs to the military as well. And from an operational standpoint, as I mentioned, there are simple reasons why the military can't abandon fossil fuels tomorrow. I mean, right now, the average Marine Corps platoon is carrying 70 pounds of batteries with them as they go into battle. So how you think about that, and how do they recharge those, how do they replenish those kinds of energy issues, are a part of that. We've talked about green aviation fuels and maritime fuels. They're out there, they're available, but they're much more costly and not widely available. And so now you have to configure engines that can comfortably and efficiently and economically burn both. And so there's some other operational concerns, but it all comes back, I think, to cost and tempo. And I don't think any of us in this room would be against an energy transition. What we may disagree with is the pace at which it's technologically achievable and economically affordable, and how much has that been skewed by our efforts to push technologies perhaps before they're fully ready in order to make that transition. So I guess just some additional factors to think about as we all talk about those three legs on that three-legged stool.
Jim, I completely agree on the tempo part, especially I think on having the right speed of energy transition.
Well, I was going to say that I didn't realize that, or rather I was going to say, it's very rare you get two admirals on the stage. So I've been sort of scouring my mind for naval quotes. I haven't gotten it yet, so I'll try and promise you at the very end. But I just wanted to build on what the Admiral mentioned. And if I may also push a little bit, I do agree that the temporal element is extremely, extremely key. But as we all know, we are well past the 1.5. degrees. And if you look at Southeast Asia, that growth is going to spurt within the next 15, 20 years. And that is going to itself, I think, contribute, take up on its own, like 25% of the 400 or, 50% of the 200 that's already left as far as our overall budget. So in some ways, I don't think we have that much time as far as this transition is concerned. And we probably need to think about, from a financing perspective, two difficult problems to solve. The first difficult problem to solve is that from an energy mix perspective, a lot of these current generation capacities at low cost are locked into long-term PPA contracts. And because they are locked in very well, it is very difficult to exit out of these things without having some cost as far as the investors are concerned. How do you restructure these things? Either through a hybrid arrangement, for example, where it's about future carbon avoidance, but then having some form of a cost and tax associated that then can translate into something that you can do on the balance sheet. So I think that's one key element from a financial perspective to actually shift the energy mix to do early retirement as far as coal, for example, or some of these less sustainable is concerned. But there's the other element, which is that I'm generally not a very firm believer in subsidies, because subsidies must be applied in a very targeted way. I think, for example, and the cost must be commensurate with the objectives you're trying to achieve. One of the biggest deployers of solar in Southeast Asia today is actually Vietnam. But it was because Vietnam had true regulatory fiat instituted a very, very high feed-in tariff. Mm-hmm. And then there was an expectation as far as a certain financial IRR is concerned, and there's huge surge. And they did it, and they were willing to pay a premium because they felt that from a security perspective, they wanted to change and have a much more domestically oriented energy sector. But they recently had to dial back these feed-in tariffs. And as a result, I think it has upended the economic model around some of these things. So I would also be a little bit cautious as far as subsidies. In this element, it must be done in a targeted way with a view to what is that long-term goal and sort of sustainable economic model. So I thought I both agree with the Admiral as well as sort of a small counterpoint.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And if we're asking people to invest, if we're asking companies to invest or nations to invest, they need and will demand predictability.
Exactly.
And yes. To your point, you can't do a bait and switch. You can't promise something and give them the impression it's going to be there forever, have them build an industry or an economy or a factory on that basis, and then pull the rug out from under them later. But getting back to incentives, somebody once told me in speaking about leadership, the role of leaders is to change the culture of an organization in the final analysis. And that could be applied, I suppose, at the national level as well, changing the culture of the country. But cultural change can take a long time. But with the right incentives, you can change behaviors overnight. And so I'm not against behaviors, to offer the counterpoint. But George Shultz used to be a big proponent of the revenue neutral carbon tax, for example, where that was going to be applied as a percentage or proportionally to the amount of carbon that you generated, and that it would be given back to the people, not to the government to spend as they wish, but in checks back to the individual citizens. He thought that would be a tremendous incentive to do the right thing, and so again, I'm not against those kinds of interventions in the market either, as long as they're even-handedly applied over the broader context. The challenge we have, inevitably, in the renewable sector, for example, is we have lobbyists, we have industry promotion efforts, we have folks that are not a part of we need it all or an inclusive approach to our energy demands, but rather see to the needs of their industry. If you're in the solar business, for example, you have data that shows solar can do it all. If you're in the wind industry, for example, you have similar analysis and models that indicate that it's all you need. Nuclear probably has the same kind of capabilities. The fact of the matter is, Will, as you pointed out, It's all about the mix. And the proportion of those elements in any organization or mechanization is going to change over time, as well it should. And you've got to have that flexibility, but it can't be, as the Admiral's saying, so rapid that you're whipsawing the industry back and forth, whichever element of the industry you're in, so that you don't have predictability. And you can't build a comfortable business model based on that. And so I think that's part of the tempo piece as well. Not just how quickly we're going, but how quickly are we changing directions back and forth, and what mixed signals get sent as a part of that outcome.
So in a few minutes, we're going to open up the floor to questions. We probably have time for 2 or so questions. So please think a little bit about what you want to ask the 2 admirals. Maybe moving on from the supply side to the transmission side. So as Chuen noted earlier, Southeast Asia sees abundant hydro in regions like Laos, abundance of geothermal in Indonesia. How do we, in terms of electricity, how do we connect them all? What is the latest in terms of innovation in the transmission space?
Well, I think one of the very important endeavors, which I think we must pay a lot of attention to, is both the ASEAN power grid as well as I can't remember the exact acronym for it, but the combined or the interoperability of the gas pipelines within Southeast Asia. The reason I say this is because both from a security as well as affordability perspective, within Southeast Asia, you have Laos, which has a population of about 7 million. It's got huge supplies of potentially low-cost hydropower that its own demand will never use up. Parts of it, for example, in Sabah and Sarawak as well. The same could be made for other elements, be it geothermal and so on and so forth. So the ability to trade actually brings about huge advancements in regional, both security as well as regional affordability between sort of the places which have an abundance and the places that actually do need it. And I think this transmission element is moving forward. For example, I think the connectivity, and this is not easy because the connectivity requires both a technical element of it to allow the grids to connect, and that is by itself not trivial. The governance elements associated with making these agreements sort of watertight, and then of course sort of buffer-proofing them against bilateral relations across neighbors that may or may not spur up from time to time. But I understand that Thailand, for example, is importing huge amounts from Laos right now. I believe it was about 4 to 9 gigawatts. Vietnam, likewise, in a contract and an agreement. And actually, even in faraway Malaysia and Singapore, I think recently, not direct, but through the onward transmission down, going south from Laos to Malaysia to Singapore, I think 100 megawatts was actually transferred. So I think this is a very powerful tool as far as that connectivity of that ASEAN power grid on that transmission element is concerned, which I think brings huge potential as far as both security as well as affordability.
Well, this conversation can go on for hours. Just to wrap up before we open for questions, the path forward will rely on innovation on the policy front, on the technology front, on the capital front. I want to just focus on one particular aspect, partnerships. The US is a very important security partner in the region. Both the US and China are significant economic partners and also technology partners. Admiral Ellis, give us a sense on the importance of US and China participation in the region.
Well, it's unarguable. I mean, when you talk about, as we alluded to this morning, the complete phrase, I think, is when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, I think is the aphorism that I'm familiar with. And so there's a undeniable realization of the presence of those two entities. On the one hand, the United States, and on the other hand, China. And there's a legitimate concern about, as we heard this morning as well, being caught in the middle of that. We've heard it articulated to us very clearly as we have security dialogues with those in the region and in the Indo-Pacific writ large, where they'll come to us, they'll almost in a plaintive plea say, we see what kind of war you're offering us. What kind of peace are you offering us going forward? In other words, what's the path and the opportunity here that assures us that we don't have to pick sides, that we can exist and an environment where we pick the relationship that's right for us. And so I think I'm just acknowledging the level of concern that was implied in your question, Will. But the second point is, how do we better serve that? And I think Dr. Rice mentioned it in her remarks this morning. How are we doing the United States, for example, on the economic side, on the trade relations side and the like? You could make a compelling case that we're not present and is nearly as effective and visible and at the scale that the People's Republic of China is. I mean, there is no Belt and Road Initiative equivalent, for example. We've got some mechanizations through international banking organizations and the like that aspire to that, but we're not there yet. And so it's not enough to force a choice on folks. In fact, it's exactly the wrong thing to do on purely ideological reasons. You've got to give them an alternative, an opportunity, and something that they now can accept those opportunity costs if they choose to, looking at the political realities, the long-term vision, if it's in the nuclear space, do I align myself with China, with Russia, or with the United States, for example? And what are the benefits and the pluses and minuses, if you will, of those relationships? So you can't ignore the reality that it is about making a choice, but you also need to understand the need for a viable alternative, a viable and sustainable, in both senses of the word, alternative going forward. And I think that ought to inform the way in which we craft opportunities and partnerships. Things have to change. We've got to be able to realize the economic situation in which our potential partners in Southeast Asia currently exist. We need to understand the financial realities of this. We need to understand what it's going to take to attract investment, because, and from an American perspective, the investment often comes from the private sector. It does not come necessarily from the government, as might be true in the case of China or Russia, for example. So there are some differences. There are some opportunities. I think there's some real advantages in aligning yourself with the American and the West. But again, that's got to be a national choice, and it's got to be for the right reasons. And as the Admiral indicated earlier, over the long term, it's got to be sustainable.
Thank you, Jim. Chuen, your thoughts on U.S.-China participation in the region?
I think the reality will be that all of this will be driven by national interests. Interests as far as the US is concerned, interests as far as the Chinese are concerned. And then as far as within the region, within Southeast Asia, I think we should be very clear-eyed with regards to then what are the investments and the collaborations you go into to meet those mutually beneficial interests. I think the being open to the technology that's available, be it either from the US or from China, or from the capital that's available from the US or that from China. I think these are things that we have to be considered well. If you look at, for example, solar, there are natural advantages as far as solar panels, for example, or solar technology coming from particular sources are concerned. But when you talk about advanced areas like, for example, nuclear power, small modular reactors, the new molten salts, passive safety, then obviously then looking at technologies from other countries can make sense. So I think the truism here is that if Southeast Asia is able to take a look very objectively in a neutral kind of manner and not have to pick sides from that geopolitical lens, but then so as to make the best of both worlds as far as what is needed for Southeast Asia's own needs. I think technology is going to be extremely, extremely key as far as the mitigation around climate change is concerned. And we're here in Stanford, which is the mecca of technology. I think a lot more can be done on that front.
Chuen, thank you so much. We have time for about 2 questions, and please use the mic in the aisle.
Hi, professors and guests. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Melissa Zhang, and I'm a Graduate School of Business alumna. And currently, I'm an energy transition, both energy developer and investor in the Bay Area in Canada and Texas. We've recently been developing power projects to supply AI hyperscalers in the US with decarbonized power. And I've had the good fortune of going to Ecosperity Week in Singapore, where this topic was also of high interest. What I'm hearing is that speed to power, cost, and scale are really key, and sustainability is a 2029 or later nice to have. And I'm really interested in hearing all three of your viewpoints on what you have been seeing in both AI security as well as energy security as far as data center proliferation is concerned. Thank you.
That's well, I'm glad you were in Singapore for Ecosperity. It is a huge topic. I will not be able to cover all elements associated with it, but maybe let me just touch on maybe 3 points. Maybe the first one, when you look at something, and of course, the whole discussion is around AI, power hungry, water hungry. How do you feed all of that? And that is indeed a very, very, very real issue. I was reading, actually, it was almost 3 or 4 years ago, there was this cartoon, and it was a cartoon then that said, next to every data center is a nuclear reactor, and next to that nuclear reactor is a bunker. And that was 3 or 4 years ago, and I thought that wasn't quite funny. But now 2 of the 3 are actually going to happen, which is, next to a data center might actually be a nuclear reactor. But the reason I wanted to place a little bit of a magnitude around this is because if you talk about digital technology, of which AI is just one part, digital technology as a whole, it takes up about 1 to 1.5% of global electricity. But if you talk about how it contributes to economic growth, actually it's very clear that from a balanced perspective, the GDP intensity of digital technologies is almost 10 times. So the studies have shown that, for example, for every terawatt, you can be getting about 5 billion worth of GDP, whereas compared to heavy industries, so that's for digital economy, for heavy industries, you're only getting 1/10 of that, 500 million per terawatts. So I think the ability to both embrace the digital technology as a key power driver for meeting that economic growth, but at a very, very low carbon intensity, I think it's going to be a key trend, and it's going to net be positive, even though the take of that individual data center as far as AI is concerned, I think is going to be very high. And if I may, for example, even something like AI, the ability for AI to now control nuclear fusion, for example, I think it's going to unlock a lot of synergies as far as that is concerned. Or AI being in your grid, I think there have been estimates that will save you 10, 15% as far as energy is concerned. So I think net, the power of digital technology is going to be positive, notwithstanding the take it has as far as electricity is concerned. I hope that helps.
Paul Wolfowitz.
We have time for one final question. Oh, please.
This is a huge one, but I'll try to keep it. There's no simple answer. I'll try to keep the question simple. My name is Paul Wolfowitz. Admiral Ellis and I both had the privilege of working for Ronald Reagan. The best job I ever had in my career was his ambassador to Indonesia. My question is the following. President Reagan used to say often, a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. He didn't mean, therefore, we surrender. He meant we prevent such a war. And Secretary Shultz said that many times himself. I've thought in the last year or two that if you think about a war in Asia, and God forbid there shouldn't be one, a long war in Asia cannot be won and must not be fought. And my question, I can't resist with 2 very knowledgeable admirals in front of me. What do you think would be the role of energy in a short war or a long war in Asia, and how might that be used to prevent one?
Well, Paul,
easy to ask, but not easy to
actually, it was during the Bush administration that we worked together. Thank you very much. When you were Undersecretary of Defense. So
both.
Anyway, but as I mentioned earlier in passing, energy is going to be critical in a crisis, even if it doesn't lead to conflict. And the things that cascade through all of that from a regional perspective are huge. Even in the escalation to a crisis, there's a clause in the international maritime insurance industry that called the 5-party war clause, that if 2 of the countries in that 5-party, 2 of which are China and the United States, are at the cusp of a conflict, even if it's declared or undeclared, that all your insurance for your ships are void. The war clauses and the war insurance no longer applies. And so there's going to be a self-deterring, quarantining or self-embargoed element to energy transition in the region. And so, I mean, that's just the beginning of it. I mentioned the needs that we have for energy security, and the United States Navy buys and accesses over 50% of its petroleum products in the Indo-Pacific from local production. It doesn't bring that resupply from San Diego, for example. Is that going to be available to them if the country is under pressure from China geopolitically, or if, more importantly, those nations in the time of crisis are husbanding all of that for their own domestic needs? So there's answer to Paul's question. It would be huge, and we're not accustomed to that kind of a conflict. But Paul, back to your basic premise, I want to reassure you that we're still mindful of conflict. I spent a week in Beijing and Shanghai 2 weeks ago talking about strategic stability with the Chinese. So we're still talking, at least, and we're looking to avoid that circumstance that you described. Admiral, over to you.
First, it's a real pleasure to have you in the audience. And again, thank you for your service over many, many, many years. I'm going to be a little bit more philosophical and a little bit of truism. This is not a naval quote, but any military person here will know that war is a continuation of policy by other means. And at the end of the day, what is that policy instrument, or what is that policy outcome that you are chasing? And I can see the scenario potentially bifurcating in two directions. If we don't get the energy transition and the energy mix right, and therefore the dependence on imports and exports of fossil fuels, and then therefore that is going to last longer than is required. There will be increasing scarcity associated with it. And then obviously then the issue around sea lanes of communications and the ability to access those resources, then I think that becomes a sphere of contestation. And when there's a sphere of contestation, then national interests start to butt against one another. And that is possibly one trajectory in which this will go, because ultimately energy will become scarcer. But the other trajectory is that if the energy transition happens well, and there's increased security as a result, and then it becomes removed from the overall calculus, then I think we're in a better position as far as this is concerned. But maybe I end off by saying that, to expect the human condition to have no competition, I think at the end of the day, competition is what drives human potential and human movement. So to expect no competition, I think, is wishful. Here is where having that competition managed through rules and norms, I think is extremely key. And the ability for the two of us who are sort of naval by training, if I may hark back to a previous era where, during the height of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US, it was during that time that they actually put in place the core tenets around UNCLOS with regards to what you actually do out at sea, and how do you respect territorial borders. So if that could be achieved at that point in time, I don't see why, or at least I'm optimistic, that coming up with a set of rules and norms to manage the competition and the big power rivalry, I think should be something that we should strive towards in all of the domains.
Admiral Ellis, final words of wisdom.
Well, thank you, Lou, and thank you, Admiral. It's been a delight to be a part of all of this. But I go back to and quote the president's remarks from earlier this morning, because of the fundamental underpinning of all of this is leadership. Okay, and you are all those leaders. This is not as George Shultz used to remind us, democracy is not a spectator sport. It's a full contact sport, and I think it's not my intent in the conversations that we've had to belittle the well-trodden energy arguments and pathways of the past. But it's time for new think. It's time to consider things in a different perspective that has a better chance of recognizing the opportunities that are now before us and the obligations that come with them, and brings us to a new commitment, and I would argue a new energy agenda. So thank you, Will.
Well, please join me in thanking Admiral Ellis and Admiral Liu for their very insightful dialogue.